All right, thank you for your patience, everybody. We're just getting the audio and video started. My name is J.R. Stormont, and I am the Chief Customer Officer at Cloudability. And really excited to be here. This is Amazon Summit season, which for us means flying to Sydney and London and New York and all the places they have the summits. But San Francisco is always one of my favorites because it's really great companies here and just a really exciting buzz around companies doing interesting things with Amazon. So in my role as Chief Customer Officer, me and my team get to work with some of Amazon's biggest users and help them figure out really how to build out this culture of cost management that we're going to be talking about today. We get to work with some of these folks up here, as well as companies like GE and Nike and Autodesk. All these companies have a similar theme, which is that they're scaling on Amazon, and they're trying to figure out how to be more efficient in their spending, and that's what we help them with. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about here today is really based upon the experiences we've had working with these companies and seeing what works and what doesn't as they scale up. So what is cost management, and really why should you care about it? In order to answer that question, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's happened in the world of infrastructure over the last few decades. In the old days, for those of you who remember data centers, there used to be a very small amount of decisions that were made each year by a very small amount of people in order to buy servers. Basically, everybody would get together and they would figure out what their capacity needs were looking like for the year or for the next 3 years, and you'd factor in spikes and Black Fridays or any big events that were coming, and you'd end up writing one or two or a few big checks in order to say, this is what we need. And the great thing about this was once you made the purchase, you were done. There weren't going to be a lot of surprises about how much you were going to spend. You knew what you were buying. The downside was that you had to buy ahead of capacity. So you had to buy for those spikes even before you were having them. So you ended up with a lot of servers laying around unused. So in the new world, you've got tons of little decisions, many decisions that happen each and every day by lots of different people in your organization. You might have, as a lot of our customers do, 150 or 200 developers who all have the power to spin up an instance. And as a result of that, they can get what they need really quickly. It's great. They've got agility. They don't have to wait for servers to be provisioned. The downside is you've got this decentralization of spending control, and it makes it a lot harder to manage what you're going to spend at the end of the month, let alone at the end of the year. So the reason this needs to be cultural, and it can't just be one or two people, is that cloud is no longer one person's responsibility. You've got a whole range of folks who are looking at the spending and influencing it in different ways. And they need specific tools in order to do this. So in the days of the data center, you used to have dashboards kind of like this. In an old car, you could track your miles per gallon, or your mileage on the odometer, and then you could go to the gas station and you could fill up, and you could figure out what your miles per gallon were. The problem is nobody really wanted to spend the time doing that because the separation between the actions you were taking and the feedback you were getting about your efficiency were just too far apart. There was a gap. And so most of us just drove around and didn't really think about it, and we used whatever gas we needed to use. On cloud, it's very much like an electric car. In some of the newer cars where you have something like this. You have a dashboard that can actually tell you, as you're driving, how the weight of your foot is going to affect how much you're going to spend in your miles per gallon. And if you've ever driven a car like this, it becomes kind of like a game almost, where you want to see how efficient you can become. You want to see if you can get the little lines going backwards into the battery instead of going out of the battery into the wheels. And it's not even really just about that money savings. It becomes this habit of efficiency. You just instinctively change your driving style because you have this data available to you. So how do you build that type of culture? It's pretty easy. You put data into the hands of the people. And we're not talking about putting it there on a monthly basis or quarterly. Really, you need to get it to them each and every day. So like in the Prius example, you want the people who are making the actions, taking those actions, to have the data they need to make better decisions as they're making the decisions. You also want to enact policies and evangelize best practices. And this seems obvious, but it's important to remember that for most companies, scaling on cloud is a very new thing. And most people really don't know where to start. We're going to talk a bit about that further on. And you want to incentivize good behavior. Share the information. Share other teams, how this team is doing versus that team. Let people know that it's good to be efficient. It's good to save. And what happens when this works? Well, there's no surprises. The bill isn't bigger than you expected, which means that everyone is on the same page. That makes budgeting easier. It results in better decisions from engineer to CEO. And finally, everybody's favorite, you end up saving money. So sounds pretty good. How many people who are running on Amazon or cloud service feel like they have this type of setup now? You feel like you've got a culture of cost management? All right, one of them. So for everybody else, we're going to talk a bit about how to develop that culture. And again, how we've seen a bunch of these large Amazon users over the last few years develop more than just a view where they're looking at the bill once a month, something that is deeply embedded in the entire organization. So context for getting into those 5 stages of how companies get there, I want to share with you the story of how we see pretty much every company we've worked with scale on cloud. So in this graph, we're going to see dollars on the y-axis, and we're going to see time on the x-axis. And this represents an adoption curve for a company going onto cloud. And it usually starts like this. Initially, there's some dev test. So we're going to see, maybe it's just an individual developer spinning up an instance or a small team that doesn't want to wait for resources to be provisioned. Invariably, at some point after that, there is a hiccup, or what we call an involuntary load test, where somebody accidentally leaves on some servers for some period of time, has a small spike in the bill. Once that's corrected, a few weeks later, we generally have a POC that goes live. If that goes well, which it usually does, we end up with the first app hitting production. And that's a big moment. Usually there's a lot of high fives and backslapping. And shortly after that, further apps go into production. And during this time, what we see is that people aren't really thinking about cost. They're really just thinking about agility. They want to get their stuff out the door. They don't want anything to fall down. They want to go, go, go. And that trend kind of continues on until invariably, at some point, they hit this. The point at which someone on the exec team starts to really care about the bill. At this point, all kinds of pressure comes into play about we need to get spending under control. We need to figure out where the waste is. We need to get everybody in line. And that's about the point where we usually start working with companies. Now, the really smart companies do this much further or much earlier back in the process. They start maybe at the POC or even after that first involuntary load test. But the cycle that we see companies go through, and this is, I've actually been using this graph a few times in a few talks for the last year, and most of this is represented from large enterprise companies that we work with. I actually went and pulled Cloudability's own spending on Amazon, and it looked exactly like this. It was pretty interesting. So this really applies small companies or big companies. But invariably, the companies go through the same life cycle when they do get things into check, and it generally falls into these 5 stages. So the first one on the bottom, visibility. This is all about getting rid of surprises. How do we make sure that people know what's happening, so at the end of the month, we know what the bill's going to be? The next stage is allocation. Oops, hit the button too fast. The next stage is allocation, which is all about figuring out where the dollars are going and breaking it up between business units, cost centers, P&Ls, even environments. Then we get into efficiency, which is going to be about finding waste and turning off resources that are no longer needed. Then savings, which is probably everybody's favorite stage, again, because at this stage you've figured out what you need, and now you're determining how you can lower your rate with things like spot or reserved instances. And finally, unit cost, which is all about tying business metrics back in with your spending. So you're not just looking at the total bill, you're looking at the bill's effect on your margins and can actually see how that relates to the business goals. So let's dive into each of these. The first one, cost visibility. In the Prius example, it's what gets measured gets improved. So in each type of company on cloud, or any company on cloud, you tend to see 2 groups of folks. You see those who are incurring costs, and then you see those who are watching costs. The incurrers are going to be engineers or operations people, somebody in DevOps who are spinning up resources. And the cost watchers tend to be a much smaller group initially, because these incurrers may be 10 different teams, 20 different teams, 30 different teams, and initially you generally have this, just 1 or 2 people who are watching costs. And that's going to be maybe a finance person who's been tasked with it. It might be an interested exec who is worried about the bill. Or it might just be an obsessed product manager who is really into seeing what's happening. So in order to really start to attain balance on that first phase of visibility, you need to get those 2 more closely aligned. And it's not necessarily about creating more watchdogs. It's not trying to slap the wrists of people. What you want to do is create an environment where where the incurrers of cost suddenly become managers of cost because they have the data they need and they can improve their decision making. So to make this happen, it's pretty straightforward. You need to get each stakeholder the spending fundamentals daily. If they're not seeing the impact on their actions one day from the impact on the bill from their actions the previous day, they're not going to be able to make better decisions. You also want to let each team see the other team's spending habits. It's amazing when you put these things up on a dashboard and show this team is at this efficiency and this team is at this efficiency, how a fair bit of healthy competition comes into play pretty quickly. And finally, just to get that information out there as broadly as possible, let everybody see what everyone is doing. If you don't have a way to do that, Cloudability offers some really great tools. There's a fully customizable widgetized dashboard that you can give finance a view that's all about dollars and business units and cost centers, or you can give engineering a view that's all about reserved instance utilization rates and CPU and bandwidth. So you can slice and dice this really in any way you want, which is really the first step in making sure that everybody, whether they're a cost incurrer or a cost watcher, is getting the visibility they need to make better decisions. So the next stage, allocation. So often people try and skip over this, but it's really a fundamental, foundational layer for the rest. So this is the stage in which we are going to try and split up the bill. And we need to figure out where the dollars are going. Are they going to this product or this product? Is it this team or this team? And this is actually pretty complex because in your average cloud deployment at a large company, you have a lot of different people involved. You've got a lot of business units, you've got different products, you've got different environments and teams, and they can be dealing with hundreds or thousands of resources. In fact, some of our large customers, they use the detailed billing report from Amazon, which gives you a breakdown of what you are spending. It's a CSV file. And for these customers, they have 300 million line items in these files that are generated each and every month. So it's a ton of data, and it's really the devil is really in the details on this. So as much as possible, you want to strive to get all the people together in the same room early on to figure out how they want to break it down so that finance has a say and if it's broken by cost centers, and engineering can decide if they want it broken by roles or tiers or environments or anything else. And you really have two basic tools in order to do this splitting of costs. You have tags and you have linked accounts. Now tags are very flexible. You can apply 10 at a time, you can change them, lots of different reporting dimensions. But it's hard to get complete coverage with tags because someone has to go and tag the thing either at deployment time or after the fact. And not everything can be tagged. Linked accounts, on the other hand, a series of accounts that roll up under a master payer, offer the cleanest chargeback. You know if something is running in there, it belongs to this P&L, it belongs to this cost center. But you're limited in how you can report. You just have that one dimension. And so this is a model we see folks use pretty effectively, which is to use linked accounts, the blue boxes on the left, for the items that have separate financial reporting needs. So they have maybe a different P&L or different cost center associated with them. You do not want those things to get mixed up. Put them in a separate linked account. On the right side, we tend to see people using tags for more operational pieces. What is the role? What is the node, the cluster, the tier? I will tell you the debate that we have constantly with customers and enterprises is between the finance and operations teams, the finance teams want to use linked accounts because it's very clean. I know that when I report, I'm going to get the right numbers in the right bucket. And the operations engineering team wants to use tags because they're flexible and you can do 10 at a time and you can move them around. There is no wrong answer here, but there are advantages and limitations to both sides. So as much as you can develop a hybrid solution, the better you're going to be. Down the road, when a VP at some point asks for a breakdown and you want to make sure that you can give them a complete set of data. So within Cloudability, you can also take that data and carve it up into a bunch of little different pieces. So you can say, I just want a portion of the spending that is our accounts from the US, and I want only things tagged with the environment of production, but I don't want to include this one account. So you can carve off these very specific and granular bits of the data, either cost or usage, and you can then give that to an individual person, like Amy Smith here. And this is really that first step in getting that visibility they need in order, again, to be more efficient. So to get started on the allocation process, first and foremost, start talking about the consensus on the taxonomy. What do we really want to track? We do find that although it is everyone that needs to be involved in this, it's generally good for finance to drive a bit of that conversation, because often they're going to have the most stringent reporting needs. They need things to be broken down very clearly. You also early on wanted to find some really clear, mandatory, required tags. In other words, nothing goes out with these things without these 2 or 3 tags applied. There's 2 ways you can do that. You can either do it on deployment and either make it a policy, or you can require it through some orchestration suite like Puppet or Chef or CloudFormation. Or you can do it after the fact. We see a lot of people try and tag after resources have gone out. generally doesn't work very well. You end up with 50% of the stuff untagged. Somebody gets upset because they need to run a report, it's not there. There's a lot of fingers being pointed. As much as possible, make it mandatory and make that a technological process instead of a policy process. And finally, if it's not working, or even if it is early on, consider a tag or terminate rule. This basically says if an instance is not tagged within 24 or 48 hours of going online, we're going to have a monkey, a chaos monkey or something like that, shut it off automatically. And this can be a little bit scary. Usually people start it in dev and test. We have seen people do it in production as well. But it is probably the most effective way in order to get that cultural aspect in, that the tagging is important. We need to know what things are, so make sure your things are tagged. So the third stage of building the culture of cost management is efficiency. And this is all about really using just what you need and nothing more. One of the reasons this is important, my favorite example, is there are 168 hours in any week and every week. And out of those 168 hours, it turns out that 108 of them are actually nights and weekends. And most of the companies we work with don't actually have people working all 168 hours a week. They have people working that smaller portion. So despite that, we still see people tend to over-provision. They leave things on all the time, regardless of whether or not they're being used. The takeaway here really is don't run the cloud like you run a data center. 65% of the hours in the month are nights and weekends, which means you have tremendous opportunities for savings if you can take advantage of those periods. And there's actually a ton of different ways that you can optimize for EC2. EC2 is generally the biggest line item on anybody's Amazon bill, with very few exceptions. I'm going to talk about three very quick wins and three of the most important things that I think you should look at early on for optimization on EC2. The first is, as we mentioned earlier, just turning off things that are not being used. So a great place to start with that is look at CPU, look at bandwidth, look at disk I/O. And are those things at zero? Are they very low? It's a good chance that instance isn't being used very well. Cloudability offers some pre-canned reports that'll do this. The power really, as you develop your process though, is that you can take these reports and customize them to whatever thresholds you want. So development might have a different CPU threshold than production, and the staging environment might have a different disk I/O threshold, and different teams may have different levels that are considered efficient. So you really want to do that analysis to figure out what is a good use of this box, and then we can help you sort of build out those reports from there. Another great way to save money is to schedule the dev test downtime on those 65% of the hours. So a lot of people have offshore dev teams. They're working hours that are not the same as other teams on the group. But almost always you can find a period of time. Maybe it's late Sunday night or Saturday night before Australia has become Monday morning. Maybe it's 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. In certain time zones that you can turn things down. It's actually not that hard. In fact, our team internally recently did an exercise on this where we're basically now tagging resources with timeframes when they should be on or off, development resources. And we've actually got an open source tool, if you want to check it out. It's called the Cloudability Valet, V-A-L-E-T. You can Google, it's on GitHub, that will look for those tags and basically turn the resources on and off at the timeframes that you've specified. We've seen people save tens of thousands of dollars a month with this type of approach. Definitely worth looking into. One of my favorites also is finding old instance families that can be upgraded. So M1s to M3s, for example. The newer instance families are faster and they're cheaper. The only downside is that they have smaller hard drives. So what you want to look for with a report like in number 2 here is something that has, or instances that have EBS usage and low access to the ephemeral disks. Those indicate that you're probably not using the internal hard drives very heavily. And if you can make this type of move, you can save 3 to 10 cents an hour, which is pennies, but if you're like a lot of the customers we work with, they may have tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands. We had a customer last year we worked with who had over 1 million hours a month of M1 usage. Moving to M3 was a pretty substantial cost savings for them. And ideally, you're not checking on this data. You're having it sent to you when it's happening. So if you can, set up alerts. Say, when I've got this many of underutilized instances, let me know. When I've got this percentage of my infrastructure that is not tagged, let me know. When I've got more than 1,000 hours a month of M1s, let me know. So that you're not getting in a place where you're asking people to go sort of out of their way to add another piece of work to their day to go check on that data. So in this phase, really as much as possible, automate the process, right? Get weekly reporting if possible to each team. And engineers and operations people often do well with gamification situations. We found in our own team, by making this information broadly available, it gets to be an exciting process where we can sort of compare teams. We can see who is squashing the most underutilized instances. Gamifying this as much as possible becomes a really exciting process. And then doing a monthly review of all the stakeholders, from finance, from ops, from engineering, from the interested exec, whoever it is, to say, how can we be better next month? Early on, ideally, starting this so that as we scale, we've got a culture where we're able to really get ahead of waste before it happens. Fourth stage, most talked about, everybody loves this. It's we figured out what we're using, we think we know, now we want to lower the rate. And the rate generally gets lowered either with spot instances or reserved instances. Spot instances are very powerful, very effective for dropping your costs. They do require some tolerance within the code or the job you're running for the instance going away because you're not guaranteed the time with spot. So for the purposes of this talk, we're going to focus on reserved instances because reserved instances are actually something that finance can reduce costs without actually involving engineering at all, and probably more important, without touching the infrastructure. So they can go in there and actually drive the bill down without really involving other teams. So when buying reserved instances, and RIs, by the way, are a shockingly deep topic. We have multiple hour-and-a-half-long webinars we've done on this topic. We did a talk at reInvent the last 2 years on RIs. If you don't know about RIs, Google RIs, check out our blog. There's a ton of info there. I'm going to cover some more of the strategy and not really talk as much about the underlying mechanics of them, but really important thing to understand as you get into them. So when buying RIs, you really need to look at the hourly data because they are essentially coupons that are being applied each and every hour to a resource. You're not buying an instance or buying a reserved instance. There is actually no such thing as a reserved instance. It's actually a coupon that you're buying that will be applied to another instance. So in that model, you need to look each and every hour at how many instances you have running that match up with that coupon to say how many reservations do I need, because when I'm buying a reserved instance, I have to put money out. I'm paying an upfront fee. So I don't want to buy a reservation for instances that are not running frequently enough that I'm not going to make my money back. So there's a break-even point that you want to manage. So ideally, use a tool like ours that's going to tell you exactly how many you need and which ones you should keep running on demand so you're buying the right amount. The important thing here, I think, is you don't want to wait until you've got the perfect analysis done. You've analyzed everything in your infrastructure, and you know you're going to make this one buy that's going to drop your cost by 50%. You want to get your feet wet and your hands dirty really quickly and get in there and start buying, because the longer you wait, the more you're going to waste just running on demand when you could save with reserved instances. And they're really two sides of the same coin. You don't make that purchase and be done, because the reservation portfolio has to align to the infrastructure you're running. You have to have the same instance type, OS, operating system instance to match the relevant reservation on this side, which means that you really need to be constantly modifying and looking at those two so that as your 10 teams, 20 teams, 1,000 different teams are changing what they're using, your reservations stay aligned to that and you're getting the most cost savings. And a few months ago, Amazon changed the model with RIs. It's actually much simpler now, but it does mean that all reservation purchases are sunk costs, meaning you're committing to pay for every hour in the month, regardless of whether or not you use it. So you want to make sure to keep those things very closely aligned. Which leads me to this sort of process. This is a process that a lot of our large customers use. It's borrowed from Agile methodology, which is when buying RIs, you want to look at it in sort of a buy, measure, and learn approach. So you're going to make that first initial purchase, and then you're going to go back and you're going to look to see the impact of that. How did we do? What was the ROI on that purchase? On the back of that, we're going to take those learnings and we are going to modify and align our reservations to match the infrastructure and sort of continue through this as quickly as possible so you get the most cost savings opportunities. Common schedule we see is something like this. One specific day of the month, we are going to gather all the recommendations for the purchase from Cloudability or something like it, and we are going to say, we've got a bunch of modification recommendations as well. We're going to make those right away. Amazon lets you modify your reserved instances for free. You can move them within a family. You can move them within a region. One of the best things you can do, easiest money out there. It's free. You can do it as many times as you want. You can modify them. You should go do that. So the first day, people will get the buy recommendations, and they'll just make the modification recommendations because there's no reason not to. So the next day, they'll take the buy recommendations and they will evaluate them. They'll look at them against some of their plans. Maybe they'll talk internally with some other folks to make sure there's no drastic changes coming that would make these purchases invalid. And then on a set day, they make the purchase. Really key here is that you have a process in place where you have a specific person appointed or a specific group. Some companies, it's 3 people, who are focused on and measured on these RI buys. So they are incentivized to get this right. We often see that living under finance. It doesn't mean it's necessarily a finance person. It means it is somebody who is aligned with the goals of the finance org and is really incentivized to keep the rates down. Getting your feet wet with that small, immediate, and uncontroversial purchase is also very important, because what we see happen conversely is large companies will go and spend 6-7 figures in a giant buy, thinking they're going to be done for the year. They're thinking about the data center world, where they could make that 1 or 2 or 3 large purchases and walk away. I've done my cost savings. You make that purchase, and 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months later, your infrastructure is entirely different. That giant purchase is no longer relevant. So getting in a process of small, uncontroversial buys is going to be key. And uncontroversial means things like M3s in US East. I would imagine that if I looked at any of your infrastructure stacks, you would be running some amount of M3s in US East. Maybe yours is slightly different, but find those things that you know you're going to be running in the future regardless of what happens. And to buy iteratively on a schedule that you hold really sacred, because if it starts to slip, if it goes to the next month, you've missed out on a lot of cost savings. Not only potentially lost use of RIs that maybe you paid for and are not well aligned, but if you're not using your RIs, you're also running a bunch of on-demand, so you're really paying double. So keeping the schedule consistent is very important. And the 5th stage in getting the culture put together is moving to a world where we are focusing less on the total cost and more on unit costs, and specifically how they tie back to the business. So if we look back at this adoption curve that we see happen in most cloud users, this point where the exec team starts to really care is where unit cost is really the most powerful. Because here's what happens. When that point is reached, generally people go back and there's a lot of pressure to do efficiency, like turn things off. There's a lot of pressure to buy RIs. They make some big purchases. And the next month, after all that work, the bill still goes up, but just doesn't go up quite as steeply. The takeaway there is that the bill going up is not necessarily a bad thing if your business is growing. And what you want to get to is something like this. What is our cost per X? And I'm not talking about a cost per server. I'm talking about something like this. What is our cost per subscriber, or page view, or customer, or API call? This is a unit of value that you are delivering to your customer with your cloud spending. To calculate this, it's actually pretty easy. I'll get to the formula here in just a minute. The reason this is important is that over time, you want to show that your unit cost is going down even as your total bill is going up. Because if you are successful in a business on cloud, your bill may always be going up. And that's okay, because the more you're spending, if your unit cost is going down, the more your margins are also going to benefit from that. So pretty easy calculation here to do. Unit cost is some period of total cost divided by the business metric. So common example, I spent $1,000 during this month. I had 1,000 customers that were serviced by the platform. I have a $1 unit cost. So this is a great way to get a snapshot of where you are, and ideally to start to manage your business toward unit cost over time, your cloud business anyway. And I'll get into some specific examples a little further down the road. So these are the 5 stages. Start with visibility, move into allocation, work on efficiency, find savings on the rate via RIs or spot instances, and get to unit cost. This is generally both a linear cycle, meaning you want to start with visibility and move through it in a linear process, and also a cyclical one. It's never really ending. You nail one stage, you have a new team come on, and they're not efficient. You get allocation figured out, and you launch a new cost center, and you need to redo everything. Unit cost gets nailed, and you've got a new product that you're servicing that needs a totally different calculation. So you're going to be working through this, and this is why getting together on a regular basis to meet and talk about these things is very important. So what does it look like in the real world? A few examples from customers we work with on this process. So this is a good one. This is a very large Amazon customer who is in financial services that is moving hundreds of apps into AWS, all sorts of things. And what they've done is they've actually taken those detailed billing report files, and these can be hundreds of millions of line items, And using Cloudability, they've actually split them up into 750 different little views of the data, broken down by the business units, the applications, the environments, all the relevant pieces. And once they have those views, they're now sending daily spending updates to associated people. This is your part of the business. You only work on development. We're going to make sure that every day you see your spending. So that drives that ability for them to make those better decisions on a daily basis. And then at the higher level, you've got execs in finance who are essentially looking at the total spending in a weekly digest and doing monitoring of it, but also doing chargeback out of this and tying it into things like SAP systems. And one of the guys there put it really well. Their goal is to put control of Amazon resources into each product team's hands. We want to get out of the way, but at the same time, we still need oversight to stop overspending. Give them the ability to go, but make sure we have a safety net as well. So another example on the other end of the spectrum, small company, few products, but all a scaled web business. So a startup that has now gotten very large. They've actually started to push all their management toward unit cost. And they have gone so far as that each product owner looks at unit cost daily, looks at their spending and how that ties to revenue. They've got operations folks who, when they're spinning up resources, they're able to see the effect on unit cost down the road by this change. Finance is reporting monthly and quarterly on margins based on the impact of those unit costs. And most interestingly, the VPs are actually setting goals based on unit costs, not on total spending. And this is really interesting because in the past you had this conversation, which is, I need you to spend less, or don't spend more than $50,000 more dollars, or whatever this arbitrary number is. What's the right number? We don't know. By looking at it in terms of unit cost, you can say, I don't want to spend more than $1 per subscriber. If we spend less than $1 per subscriber, you can spend as much as you want because we're making more money with more subscribers. So I can set a goal that it's meaningful, that the entire business can get behind, and knows really what is the right answer, not just pick an arbitrary number. If you have trouble getting to what the right metric is for you, the right business metric, it's not subscribers or API calls, you can try doing this shortcut, which is basically taking your Amazon bill as a percentage of the revenue that is being supported by Amazon. So if you've got one product that is making $1,000 a month, hopefully it's making much more than that, and you're spending $10 a month on Amazon, divide the 10 by 1,000, you'll get your percentage. So a few more specific examples. Another customer of ours, realestate.com.au, very large. I think they're one of the largest real estate sites in Australia. Tons of traffic. They had this issue we're talking about where they have lots and lots of developers who were using dev and test instances and forgetting to turn them off or just not turning them off quickly enough. And so they actually used our API to pull a bunch of relevant data about the health of their dev and test environments and create a health score that said when an environment is, or an individual instance is healthy or not. And it basically looked a bit like this. We called it Midge's Law, so the gentleman who came up with it there. But they pulled things like the cost of the node, the CPU, how long it's been running, and they used all these API inputs to create a score that was sort of like a golf score. If it was lower, it was better. And they published this on dashboards in their shared workspaces. In the rooms with the engineers and the operations people who are actually working on this stuff, they could see what each team's score was against Midge's Law. And it's been pretty interesting from what I hear to see how people have actually just sort of started to self-police, if you will, around this stuff. We've got a whole webinar we did with REA on this, actually, with Amazon and REA. It's on our blog as well if you want to check it out. Another great one from a recent webinar that we did with Amazon and Adobe was on optimizing Adobe's thousands of reserve instances. Adobe, has been very public about their use of AWS. They're running, Creative Cloud and much of their new cloud business model on Amazon. And so they have a massive infrastructure to support, and they're well into the process. They are years into Amazon. They're very mature as an AWS user. I would say one of the more mature ones out there. And we've worked with them for about 3 years now, and particularly in the last year, I've been leaning in heavily with these reserved instances. And the way they've structured their process is they have a central team, one team, it's actually, I think, 3 people, that handles hundreds of different accounts and hundreds of different products and makes centralized purchasing decisions based on this. And they do it on this really consistent monthly schedule because when you've got hundreds of accounts and hundreds of products and potentially thousands of engineers spinning up resources, your infrastructure is going to change very rapidly. So you can't wait once a quarter or twice a year to make those purchases. So their process is roughly like this. Around the 25th of the month, they have the centralized team that gathers the inputs from our system and looks at what the purchase recommendations are, they actually don't talk much to the external teams because they're less interested in what people are planning to do and more interested in what they are actually doing. Because again, in the model of reserved instances and cloud, it's not about future forecasting about what you're going to be using. It's about covering the usage that you have now. It's sort of just-in-time RI buying, if you will. So then they make the modifications, because again, modifications are free money. They're no-brainers. Go and do them. Save money right away. And then around the 28th of the month, they will go back and make the purchase based again on this month's utilization data, not the future. And I'm sort of harping on that point because I've worked with a few companies in the last few months that were newer to the process who made a giant purchase based on what the team said was going to be happening in the infrastructure. We're launching this new product in 3 months. We're going to be using a lot of this. Or we are switching from Linux to RHEL, or whatever it was. They make the big purchase, and it turns out that takes 6 months, or they don't make the switch. And they're left holding all these reservations that they can't use. So current utilization data is very important. Oh, one other point on Adobe, and they actually talked about this in the webinar. They strive for over 80% coverage of reserved instances across a massive portfolio. And they actually save 50% off their EC2 bill by employing this process. So some serious dollars. Check out our blog if you want to see the whole webinar. It's blog.cloudability.com. So I threw a bunch of stuff at you, some case studies, a lot of various points, a lot of emphasis on important things. Wanted to leave with just a few sort of takeaways from each of those 5 stages that you can hopefully use to get started on this process. So first and foremost after this summit, figure out a way to get daily spending reports to the relevant people so that, like in that Prius example, they can see the impact of their actions and they can make better decisions. From the allocation standpoint, take the first step of getting together with your finance team and maybe anybody in ops or engineering who has passion about this and start to talk about the taxonomy. How do we want to split things out? Maybe you don't finalize it right away, but figure out what can we break by linked accounts and what can we break by tags and where can we find sort of a common ground on that. In terms of efficiency, easiest win is look for underutilized instances. Look for the low CPU, bandwidth, disk I/O, and take a look at your older instance families. Often they're relatively easy to move. There's going to be cases where you can't move to a newer family because you need that giant hard drive for some reason, but there's a lot of savings there. From an RI savings, look for where you can make that immediate, small, and uncontroversial buy. I mentioned getting the M3s and US East. Something like that is a great way to start. With this buy, it's not just about starting to save money. It's about starting to get into a process where you are in a habit of moving quickly on RI changes. And you have to get financial approvals, and you have to get the ops and engineering teams on board about what you're using. You have to get a lot of people often involved to get the process started. So try and do a small one. Test it out and see if you can get all the people more comfortable so you can ultimately end up in a place where you're doing monthly buys over time. And finally, see if you can figure out a top-line business metric. Take last month's spending and divide costs by it. It won't be automated. You might not have a dashboard for it yet, but it gives you a baseline for where you are now, and you can look again in a few months to do that. Long term, the companies we see at the biggest scale may have 30 or 40 different unit costs they're tracking for different business units. You can start with one for now if you're not there. So that's what I have for you today. We're going to take a few minutes for questions. If we run out of time, and I'm not sure where we're on time, I'm going to be at this booth for a good portion of the afternoon. There's a bunch of us out there, big blue booth with lots of free t-shirts and swag and stuff, so definitely come by and say hi. Happy to give you a demo or answer questions. If you do have questions here, I was asked by the kind gentleman back in the AV booth to ask you to go to the microphone to ask the questions because we are recording the session. So, any questions? I shouldn't have told you about the microphone. You're afraid to get up there.
Yeah, hello. We're just getting started with AWS, and I think one of the friction points I'm running into is that we have our operations group that's very focused on production environments, and we have engineering teams that are focused on non-production environments, and I think there's kind of a lot of gravity around, they only want to worry about production, someone else needs to worry about this. How do we centralize the manage of those? I mean, have you run into those situations and how do you overcome it?
So is your question about how to centralize the management or which to worry about more?
No, I'm worried about both of them. I think I just want to raise awareness around the company about we need to work together on this. We can't separate the management of these environments out if we want to do RI purchases efficiently, I think.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of nuance there. I will say that it is surprising how large a portion of the bill dev and test environments are for both early stage companies and fully scaled companies. Working closely with our engineering team, I know it's great to have a ton of environments that you can use for different development branches. They get really expensive also. So I think putting focus there is sometimes the easiest because you can push back on an instance whether or not it needs to be alive in a development environment. It's harder to do in a production environment. So I would definitely put attention there. As far as centralizing management, ultimately the people who are working on each piece need to be involved, and this gets back to if you're sending one person who's working only in development breakdown of the total bill, they're not going to know how that affects them. They're going to be looking at everything. So getting it carved out so you're each looking at different goals and metrics around that and getting it broken down. In terms of reserved instances, one thing to highlight there is that if you're buying them at the master payer level, which presumably everything is sort of under that, you don't really get to choose where they go. You don't get to say it should go to production or dev. You don't get to choose if it should go to different accounts even, if it's bought at the master level. So it's important to sort of think about RIs at a global fashion if possible, and think about the company saving money, less this environment versus this environment, which is why a lot of the scaled teams will have a centralized group who doesn't really even interact with the people running the instances because they want to optimize for the company, and they found they get the best economy of scale by doing that. So maybe I didn't answer your question directly. It's a tough one, but I think getting in there and looking closely at dev and test, and then trying to figure out how quickly you can get the right information in the hands of those people. Yeah.
So I want to actually add one point to the reserved instances.
Sure.
When you buy reserved instances and when you make upfront costs, it's true that depending on whether it's 1 year term or 3 year term, you end up committing to that. And in case if you don't end up using the instances, I think one point is you can use the marketplace to sell some of the unused instances. So my question is, there are certain type of instances where you cannot sell in marketplace, like the database instances. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you're seeing customers buy upfront instances for 3 years and stuck in a situation where they just can't sell them? Is there any solution out of it?
Yeah, I think the marketplace is a great place if you've got surplus. The majority of our customers actually are starting to use so like in our tool, we'll list out the buy, the modify, and the sell recommendations, sell being things that you technically can't use. We're seeing customers look at that sell list, not as a sell list, but sort of a free servers list. And they'll start to publish that list of unusable RIs to their teams to say, we paid for these, they're sitting there. If you want to spin up 10 giant boxes and you really only need 7, go for it. In fact, Steve Cole, who is the Adobe gentleman who runs RI buying there, in the webinar we did, he talked about a case where they had that list and they essentially had a team that did a bunch of data processing using those unusable instances. It wasn't the right size for them. They were too big, but that's okay because they're free. So definitely you can look at the marketplace. It does take some time to sell them, and you're not going to get all of it back. That's one option. But I think just getting creative about those resources is a good way to do it also.
So
Yeah.
I have a question. So you had a bunch of case studies there. Do you have any case study or any experience with where organizations are comparing their private cloud with Amazon on cost basis, where they are trying to make certain decisions? Should we even go with the private cloud or further investment in the private cloud, or should we start terminating the investment in private cloud and start moving towards the public cloud and treating it as more of a private cloud?
Yeah. I don't have specific case studies around that, and we only do public cloud, so I can't really draw a direct comparison. What I can say anecdotally, and this is going to sound like Amazon paid me to say this, they did not, is that we see time and time again large enterprises when we come in have a public cloud and a private cloud initiative, and they're often different teams, and you have an evangelist on each side who supports both for different reasons. And I can't tell you the number of times after working with the company for a year or two where suddenly the private cloud just disappears because Amazon's so easy and they can spin up what they need, and they don't have to have internal resources running it, and it changes the dynamic of the engineering teams, and they get what they want, and it's not just about the cost, and I think the cost is an important point, but using a public cloud service frees up so many resources for developing your product. We're obviously evangelists for public cloud, as you might have guessed, but that's what we've seen.
So just a follow-on question. How did you put the price on the non-tangibles that public cloud is offering? So like auto-scaling, freeing up all these resources. These are non-tangibles that, when the CFO is looking at the numbers, he's looking for the dollar amounts. I can tell them all the non-tangibles I'm getting, but at the end of the day, the bottom line is the dollar number. So how are, like from your experience, and since Cloudability is in the pricing world, how do you put that kind of number, or how do you help the customers putting some number to it?
How do we put numbers to the auto-scaling groups in terms of?
Like these non-tangibles that come as part of the public cloud offering?
Yeah, I think that's challenging. I mean, I think that most of the companies we are working with are really looking to get out of the business of managing their own cloud. They're looking to essentially lean into how they can be better at doing what they're doing. GE is a customer of ours. They recently did an article where they talked about they're going all in on the cloud because they don't want to be a cloud company. They want to be a company that's doing what they do best. So I mean, I think that there's a bit of sort of a leap of faith that has to be taken, and you have to sort of get people over the hump emotionally about cloud, and it's challenging to quantify those different or those individual pieces. Ultimately, it's going to require, I think, these summits are a great way. Andy Jassy going up there and telling the stories, but also people just seeing that, when you lean into things like the auto scaling that Amazon provides, when you lean into all the services and you're using DynamoDB and all these things, you can spend more time, getting better at your industry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. I had a question around unit costs. We've been really trying to, my company, Bright Edge, we've really been trying to dig into specific unit costs based on customers. We're trying to dive around, what the best metric is to really be able to break down and then create reporting around that for our executives. I was wondering if you had any case studies other than just customer-based unit cost that you might be able to share.
Yeah, one of the most interesting ones I've seen has been unit cost based on API calls. We've got a customer who basically has an API as a service, and this graph that they actually recently showed me really paid off unit cost, which was they had basically their graph of their spending going down over time, and at the same time they had overlaid with the number of API calls they were delivering going up, and the unit cost basically getting better and better. And that was the graph that they're taking to their SVP. This is a Fortune 500, and saying, look, we've been successful. It is challenging. I mean, if you are Netflix or you are Adobe with Creative Cloud, you can say I've got subscribers. You need to figure out what is the sort of unit of measure, of value that you're delivering to the customer. We've seen companies who've got lots of different business units that do it differently, and 10 of them can figure it out and 5 can't. So for those, they start to look at things like the percentage of revenue that Amazon is. I don't think there's always a right answer on it. If you dig deeply enough, though, you can find something that means if we deliver more of these, we make more money, and that's really what we're striving for. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. Again, we've got a big booth out there if you want to stop by and say hello. We'd love to chat more, and enjoy the rest of your summit.